Good morning. My name is Bruce Hamilton. I'm the chairman of the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board. I will preside over this morning's public meeting. With me are my colleagues on the board, Board Member Jesse Roberson, Board Member Daniel Santos, and Board Member Joyce Connery. We four constitute the board. Having established a quorum of the board members, this public meeting will now come to order. Ms. Casey Blaine, the board's general counsel, will serve as the board's executive secretary for the meeting. This public meeting was not announced on the Federal Register because of the government lack of appropriations. It will be posted on the Federal Register as soon as the appropriation is passed. We did announce it on the board's public website. And we are holding this public business meeting pursuant to the Government in the Sunshine Act, the board's implementing regulations for the Government in the Sunshine Act, and the board's operating procedures. The objective of this public business meeting is for the board to discuss recommendations of the National Academy of Public Administration and of the Inspector General. Both organizations have written reports. Copies of the executive summaries are available online at www.dnsfb.gov. I have a couple of personal opening remarks. For those who might not have been with us in December, I would like to offer a very abbreviated background of why we're having this series of public meetings. Last February, the board engaged the National Academy of Public Administration to provide an assessment of our board and agency and to offer a path to better performance. The result was an exhaustive study and an extensive report published in November entitled Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board Organizational Assessment. In parallel with the work by the National Academy, our own Office of the Inspector General conducted a study of our Issue and Commitment Tracking System, commonly called IACS, and also released a report in November which had some observations similar to those in the NAPA report. The purpose of this series of meetings is to operationalize the recommendations in those reports. Prior to the December public meeting, we determined the process by which we will proceed. First, we agreed to address each of the report's recommendations sequentially, and we've identified a board member who will lead the discussion for each. Secondly, we agreed to allocate a specific amount of time for each recommendation, understanding that we may need to come back to those should we need more time for further deliberations. Third, we intend to place each recommendation or sub-recommendation into one of three categories: closed, without further discussion, assigned to a board member for follow-up, or tabled for further discussion. And the General Counsel is to maintain a list of the disposition of these recommendations and sub-recommendations. We are keenly interested in observations from our staff, and last month we collected a large number of written comments, both anonymous and attributed. While we don't currently have a plan to address each of those comments on an individual basis, I want to assure the staff that each of us board members has read all of the comments and is using them to inform us as we proceed through this process. I'm hopeful that we will receive additional comments in the wake of today's meeting, and at some point in the near future, we will begin to engage more directly, beginning with staff leadership. This is a messy process. Organizational functionality involves the most complex machine we know of, the human mind, or rather, in this case, many human minds. Most issues we are dealing with are interdependent, and like the chicken and the egg, it is usually impossible to determine which should come first. Consequently, we have chosen to attack the recommendations in the order that NAPA presented them, recognizing that many, if not most, will require revisiting as we go through the process. This iterative approach is not perfect. It's highly unlikely there is a perfect solution, but we believe this process will be as orderly and comprehensive as is possible. I would now turn to Ms. Roberson for her introductory remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not have any additional comments today for opening.
Thank you, Ms. Roberson. Mr. Santos.
No comments.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. Ms. Connery.
So I'm going to buck the system, and I provided opening comments. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important for our staff and our stakeholders to understand the intent of these meetings, and I appreciate the fact that the chairman outlined them again. I know that the skeptics will say that this is a check-the-box exercise and not a true effort to address underlying issues. And there is historic precedent for that skepticism. I've been on the board since 2015, and this is the first time that I have seen each board member committing the time and the effort to honestly engage on the problems that exist in the board. In the past, we've had some offsites, the results of which have been mixed at best, disastrous at worst. But the board seems to be committed to doing the work, and we've had a couple of what I would call moderately successful team-building sessions offline. Are we there? Not nearly. But there's a good deal of mistrust still among board members, and to put it bluntly, hurt feelings. We are not going to fix those in the short term, but I think as long as we are making progress, we are each committed to continuing to engage in that team building. That team building is aimed at getting the board to function better, this board. And as we get this board functioning better, we'll be able to address the systemic challenges that we face across the agency, including the challenges to organizational culture and mission effectiveness. I know from the employee feedback, thank you, by the way, to those of you who provided feedback, either written or personally to board members, and we know that you aren't thrilled with the process. There are a few general comments, such as the fact that the NAPA report talks about some actions that can be taken immediately, including some of those that call for staff involvement. I appreciate that comment, but the board has to be able to speak with one voice on the direction of the agency. That's our responsibility. Once we find that voice, I absolutely agree that senior staff and other staff should be involved in helping right the ship. I can only ask for your patience, which I know is running out, and your continued excellence and dedication to the mission while we plug away. To my fellow board members, thank you for your efforts. Yesterday's session was not ideal to the reschedule and the tight turnaround. I think we need to step up our game, myself included, take more risks, and deposit more in the trust bank. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Connery. We're now going to go to the first order of business, which is to review our documents from the last public business meeting, and I'm just going to go through those recommendations. We have a spreadsheet that the General Counsel has prepared for us, and mine are the first, so I'm going to go through those and just update on where I believe we are. In recommendation 1, sub-recommendation 1, that was for me to contact the White House. We closed that. I will note that earlier this week, there was an announcement from the White House on the intent to nominate, I guess that was Friday, intent to nominate a former Colonel Thomas Summers to the board. So that's the fifth board member that we didn't know who it was going to be at the point. But in any case, that sub-recommendation is closed without further action at this point. The second sub-recommendation was to pursue legislation to restrict board member terms. Currently, the board member terms by law, when they expire, we can continue to serve. 3 of us are currently serving in expired terms. The recommendation was to change the legislation so that when our terms expire, we either have to be reappointed or we can no longer serve, much like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That legislative proposal has been put into a bin of several other legislative proposals that the General Counsel will be working on with us in the future. So I consider that it's not closed, but it's assigned to me, and that's what we're doing with it right now. The third sub-recommendation was the NAS registry of potential board member candidates, and that is also a legislative proposal that will go in that bin that the General Counsel is working on. So we had that tabled for further discussion. Unless there's any objection, I'm going to say that that's assigned to me for further action.
The only thing I want to clarify is further action is a proposal to the full board.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. That doesn't mean that you're agreeing with it. That means
Gotcha.
that I'm handling
Right.
it through that group of proposals.
Gotcha.
Okay. So
Thank
we're going
you.
to ask the general counsel to change that assigned outcome to assigned to me. And that's my recommendation 1, so we'll go to recommendation number 2, and Ms. Connery.
Wait, before we finish,
Okay.
did you want to talk a little bit about the timeline for that?
The timeline is very constricted. We're thinking that we have to get that set of proposals put through in the next month. And so general counsel is starting to work that as a top priority. And there's at least, I know of 3 or 4 different items in there, and there may be some others. So we're going to bucket it as a group of things and do it all at once. Okay. Ms. Connery.
Thank you. So the recommendation number 2 was to establish mission, vision, and principles for the DNFSB. This was assigned to me to work on, and the board notionally agreed to the fact that we will need outside help for this. So I will give you a little update, which was that I spent some time talking to NAPA, the same folks that wrote this report, about potentially helping us with the strategic plan. Now, they've been through this process before with other boards and other agencies, and they definitely had some lessons learned from how that works and how that doesn't work. I indicated that I wasn't quite sure how the process would work with NAPA, and they wanted to assure me that it wouldn't be like the NAPA process where they come and interview everybody and provide us with documents at the end. This would be a process in which they would work with us each step of the way, establish milestones in order to get us to a process. They're going to give me more information, and we'll look at whether or not we would like to go with NAPA or with any other organization. But regardless of which organization we go to, both the process, which is going to be in and of itself, I think, helpful to the agency for creating priorities for the staff and for the board, and the outcome, again, are going to be important. And I think for a timeline, my vision is that we could probably, if we contract something in March, we could probably get something out by the end of the fiscal year. But it will take, again, work of not only the outside help, the board members, both individually and collectively, as well as members of the staff. And I think they also have a process in which they can engage outside stakeholders to get input to that as well. But at the end of the day, I think what we should get is, as that process goes on and we build the milestones, it should help inform both the work planning process that the staff is going to do, any staffing planning, and then our favorite, the performance metric system. And we had a conversation about that with NAPA as well, where there's a struggle to define performance metrics that are not just quantitative, send X number of letters, but also qualitative to make sure that the products that we're putting out are of the highest caliber. And they had some thoughts and ideas about that. So
Let me just interrupt.
Sure.
I think this is a fantastic path forward, the NAP approach, for 2 reasons. One, I think we need to get somebody from the outside who can tell us how this is done with other agencies and commissions and boards. And 2, given that they just did this big assessment of us, they already have a head start in knowing what we're dealing with. So I really think this is the right direction to go.
No, I think it's a good investment. I think it will be good. Even if they hadn't done this, I think having somebody a little bit outside of the organization help keep us in the mainstream in our thinking will be helpful. So I think it's a good path, too.
The timing is going to be very important. We have all these recommendations. We're doing all this exercise, understanding the sequence and sequencing properly. I think is important. I'm sure you're taking that into consideration.
No, that's an excellent point, Mr. Santos. I actually think that if we can, I kept stressing milestone documents because I know that you in particular are a fan of milestones and schedules. When will we see what piece of it? And I think if we can divide it up in that way, again, it will help inform some of the other things that we're doing. If I know that there are other conversations we're going to have a little bit later on about the possibility of an EDO, et cetera. Again, my thought process is if the board can establish a strategic vision and a strategic plan separate from our statute, which exists, right? That's not changing, but where we need the agency to go in the next 5 years or so, if we bring in additional leadership, or even if the board members change over, they're going to be able to pick that up and run with it and then execute to the strategic planning. And then maybe that helps. Right now, we have a little bit of a disconnect in that much of what's happening is bottom up, and we need to make sure that there's a top-down prioritization of where we think we should emphasize the majority of the workforce. Additionally, some subcomponents of the agency are working as they should on their own strategic plans, and so I'm mindful of the fact that I think Human Resources is working on one, and then I think some of the folks in the tech staff have kind of a mini strategic plan for their office that has to connect up, and so we need to make sure that those things don't pass in the night.
I was just going to say, I think it's necessary. I think one of the things that's created some of our problems is the layering. And so at some point, all of that stuff needs to come together and be in alignment. And I think it's critical. I also think, although I want to see something sooner, it's kind of my nature, I also want to make sure we don't let the clock determine the quality of what we do here. So.
Thank you, Ms. Connery. Item 3 was Board Member Santos.
Yes, on the 140 piece, we are on track. We have a scheduled upcoming hearing. We communicated to the Secretary of Energy. We continue to track and monitor the implementation of the order across the sites. The aspects of legislative proposals associated with 140, my recommendation is that be added to the bin of items that we're going to be working with the General Counsel in the short term. So that will be my proposed path forward there. And I added a recommendation. We had a short discussion in the previous meeting, but it's this concept of providing some sort of guidance or statements to the staff regarding some of the jurisdictional items that are creating some confusion, whether it is worker safety, on-site transportation. We went through some of that. Right now, I think we should table that for later discussions, because if we're going to be looking at improvements to our correspondence process, how we're going to interact in public meetings, I just want to make sure those topics are not left behind. I do feel we need to provide some guidance to the staff on where's our collective vision on some of the jurisdictional items. Because right now we're handling that via individual votes and our vote comments. And while I don't think that's efficient when it comes to their ability to perform the reviews from the beginning. So I added an item to track that one. Any comments?
Yeah, I'd like to just kind of probe a little bit. Maybe you're looking at this in a more formal way than I am. To me, making a statement from the board that we all agree on that we view that, for example, the restrictions on Category 3 and radiological facilities is not a restriction that's in the Atomic Energy Act. Is a pretty simple thing to say. Do we need to, how far do we need to go in fleshing that out?
No, as you know, there's been some confusion, and the staff has been confused of whether they can conduct some reviews or not because of the perceived differences. For example, non-nuclear hazards, on-site transportation, worker safety, and that's created some confusion on whether the staff should be performing some activities on those areas. And I think we need to clear that up. So
I'll take an example. I think I personally agree that the staff is trying to read our votes to determine how to scope out their work. And we need to distinguish between the two of them. And we talked a little bit about it before on like reporting requirements, or you can take transportation, you can take atomic weapon safety, you can take anything. When it comes to making a decision individually and we take into account all the facts, for instance, you may say, I don't think there's a need for a reporting requirement. That doesn't mean the staff shouldn't propose it if they think that's what they should do. So I think we need to draw a distinction between the staff scoping out their work and them trying to read our votes to determine what jurisdictional positions we're taking. I think that's what you're saying.
That's accurate.
And I guess I'm struggling with that. Doesn't seem that hard. Sorry.
But we haven't done it. So the staff relies on our vote sheets and to try to figure this out. And I know it's creating a lot of confusion, and we should help clear that up. That's my perception.
So I don't necessarily disagree that the staff is often tries to read where it thinks the board is going to go so that it doesn't go down a path that we don't want them to. Again, I think the solution to that is not to prescribe a box within which they should work, but through the work planning process, and through strategic planning and communications, if we indicate to the staff where we place value, I think that's where the difference will be made. And in the review plans, we have an understanding of where they're going. I have no issues with them looking at transportation. I have no issues with them looking at non-nuclear things. It's what the board speaks on that's within our jurisdiction. The Atomic Energy Act does not restrict what it is the staff can do in terms of reviews. And if we get pushback from the department, I think we have to handle that on a case-by-case basis. But the issue, I think you're right, we have to communicate it, but I don't see us having an abstract conversation about, transportation security for transportation security's sake. I think it is dependent on the work plan as a whole and what we're prioritizing in terms of where we think our resources should be spent.
So I agree. It's about communication. I'm open to many different ways. The work plan could be a good discussion. So maybe we can tie it to that process, because later on we're going to talk about the work plan and how we need to improve that whole process. So I want to hear other perspectives.
No, I was going to say I don't think this is complicated, but we haven't done it.
Correct.
And there was a lot of effort put into this area in the Napa report. So whatever the simplistic way is to disposition it, I'm game for that. But we do need to clear it up. And I agree with you. It's not like I'm not sure just for the sake of saying something's in or out without looking at the specifics. I'm making no decision. But I don't want the staff scoping their efforts out, assuming that. So I just think we need to clean it up.
Understood. And I do want to make a distinction, though. There's two pieces here. One is what is within the board's jurisdiction to give advice to the secretary. Which topics are those? The other issue is what are statutory tools and how do we use them? And I think that's also throughout the Napa report, because I think there is not perfect alignment on that. And honestly, I think that is a subjective decision on the part of each board member as to whether or not they think that they're going to get the best safety outcome from using a reporting requirement or from a recommendation as a pretty clear threshold, a pretty clear nebulous threshold of adequate protection. But there are, whether or not a hearing is the best and most efficient way of getting to a particular outcome. So I think those things are much more subjective than the issues of where we.
Let me run this up the flagpole and see if I can get a salute. Would you be willing to put together a one-pager for review of the board that lists the issues that we think are the key ones that there's confusion about, and let's do a board orange folder process on this?
I'll do that. Yes. As a starting point, my goal is to bring visibility and make sure we come up with a way to clear this up. So I'll take that lead.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Roberson.
The only thing I was going to add is in alignment with that. And each issue is kind of discretionary decision by each board member. I just want to make sure we remember we've tasked the technical director to develop a policy on like reporting requirements. And so we need to make sure we wrap that in and not recreate that one again. And it may be things that working with Mr. Santos, the technical director, should do in some of these others too. But we'll have to
Yeah,
find
and
out.
when I read this particular one, maybe I'm wrongly tying it to 140.1, but I thought these were 140.1 issues.
No, I went broader than 140. We got through that. One parenthesis, and I think it's tied to some of your opening remarks. I mean, the way I see these first few meetings is this is us, the board, talking amongst ourselves. I clearly see actions and roles for the staff to help with some of these recommendations. And this one might be something that I can see staff participation. I'm just taking the first draft,
Okay.
the draft of it.
Yeah, thank you. We'll get it moving, and it'll probably have to be adjusted as we go through the process. All right, you're good with number 3 there?
Yes.
Okay, Ms. Roberson.
So I'm not going to go through the matrix. So recommendation 4 was foster deliberation and teamwork. And there were 4, I took, and I cited these the last time, kind of 4 primary pieces to this recommendation. The recommendation for more genuine deliberations, which, as I said before, I believe equals more public meetings, like we're having today. The second one was to reform the notational voting process, and each of these recommendations has a volume of information contained in the full report that we learned from. It's not just the words in the recommendation. Anyway, the reform the notational voting process. This would include reforming the correspondence process to reduce or eliminate the practice of using staff to negotiate between board members. And the third recommendation was to simplify and modernize the notational vote posting process to accentuate the decisions of the board rather than individualism. So I've discussed proposals in each of these regarding these recommendations with each board member. And I've also provided relevant information regarding how another board or commission has established an organized, disciplined, and routine approach to the conduct of their business, including public business meetings. Based on those discussions with all board members, I do not believe there is adequate board member support at this time to submit and consider a specific proposal that would be assured of successful execution. I also do not believe the board currently has the necessary infrastructure in place to properly execute the recommended changes. Establishment of a designated correspondence manager that can execute, oversee, and manage the process, voting and correspondence process, and the changes highlighted by NAPA and some specific changes I would propose to the board must be considered in conjunction with the establishment of an executive correspondence manager and an executive director of operations. I do plan to discuss specific proposals with the office director in advance as well, and I hope to do that before our next public business meeting, and subsequently, based on progress in filling the 2 key positions I cited, I would be prepared to propose specific actions to respond to recommendation 4 for the consideration of the full board. So those are those 3. There was a second, I guess a fourth part or second major part, which is the teamwork among the board members. The last element of recommendation 4 centers on board members' commitment and ability to actually work more as a team to advance the efficiency of the agency's execution of the mission. I provided a potential code of conduct for board member consideration at the last public meeting. The board is engaged in a team-building process that hopefully will yield a shared code of conduct between board members, and I'm hoping that we can achieve that notionally within the next 60 days. So that's 4.
Just for clarity, the part that you don't think is currently, we don't have consensus on is what specifically?
Specific changes to the correspondence process and the notational voting process. I don't think we're prepared to make decisions on that today.
Okay, that's a little bit different than saying we don't have consensus on it. We don't know where we're headed on this. We don't have a proposal that we're not consenting on.
Well, what I can say is I think everybody consents that
It
they
needs
want it
fixing.
improved.
Needs fixing, don't know
But
how.
what the fix is, and I also don't think we have what I don't want to do is propose something that just layers onto something that's already been problematic. So I don't think we have the infrastructure in place to execute a different approach to either of those.
Okay, so we're gonna keep the status of these the same then,
I would.
tabled for
Yeah.
further discussion. Okay.
I agree with that observation. Many have tried and many have failed. So I hope we continue to look at the lessons learned, because everybody's having complaints and issues with the correspondence systems. There's been many efforts, staff-led efforts. There's been board member-led efforts, and none have bear fruit. So I agree with your observation, and I think we ought to be careful, because if not, we're going to face the same outcome. And we need to do this correctly. So I agree. We're not there yet, but we need to engage and leverage some of the lessons learned from the previous efforts.
So to me, the challenges with the orange folder process are symptomatic. Those are just symptoms of the underlying challenges we have with communications amongst board members. And we've had a couple of, I think, recent successes on documents whereby we've kind of gone around the orange folder process and engaged in direct negotiations on specific issues in order to accommodate people's needs and obviate the need for the yellow folder, the vote, which is the amendment process for those of you who aren't into our color coding. So I think while I agree we were not ripe for the particular solution set, but we also have to look at the evolution of how we are interacting amongst ourselves to inform that, not only lessons learned about things didn't fail before because of the underlying causes, not necessarily because we had a different way of doing it. The other thing I would like to do prior to working on that is have an understanding of the first principles of where we got to the orange folder process, because that didn't exist. That's a recent manifestation of some other challenges that the previous boards had, and we inherited that process. So understanding what the needs are, what do you need from the staff in order to be able to do your work as a board member to draw your conclusions? What do you need in terms of contact with each board member in order to work toward a more consensus document? And then whether or not we need the amendment process, and is that simply a fire break? We couldn't get to a consensus, so we have to have the amendment process so that a particular board member feels that he or she is heard before we get to the notational voting piece. Because I think we allowed the system to kind of take over all the hard work for us to get to the solution set. And I was talking to Ms. Roberson earlier about the fact that one of our jobs is to take the staff product and then determine how best to communicate that to the department, and that's a collective duty. It's not an individual duty. It's a board duty. And where we have fallen apart is we have done it and said, well, this is my opinion how it should go, versus this is someone else's opinion how it should go, and then we'll just kind of see where the chips fall when we go to the voting process. And I think if we are more deliberate about how we get there, not to say that we could completely eliminate the folder process, but we may be able to move in that direction.
No. Thank you for that. And as I said, I've talked to you and the other two board members, and I think you know where I am. I'm a fan of, we have layered on based on individual board member needs and personalities, and I'm a fan of stripping away that. The one, and I agree with everything you said, the one thing I think we also need to keep in mind is whatever the system is, it needs to be sustainable, regardless to who the board members are. The history or the record behind why we may take a different position on something than what is actually submitted or proposed. That's why I'm really focused on we need to have the infrastructure in place. combined with all the other concerns expressed by you and the other board members, we can fix the system, but it won't sustain unless we have the appropriate infrastructure in place to do that. So.
I couldn't agree more that the board procedures have become a major reason for some of the problems that we're seeing. Ms. Roberson and I had a discussion a couple of weeks ago. What happened in 2012 that caused our agency from going from the number one place to work to the number next to last place to work for small agencies? And one of the things that she told me was the implementation of board procedures. There were, amongst others. So I got to think that there's something in the way we are processing our correspondence at the board level that is driving a lot of this behavior, and we just need to strip this thing away and figure out what we do need and get rid of the rest of it. So I'm fully behind it. I just don't know how to do it.
Yay, that's me. We will, everybody's submitted some really good commentary and some good ideas. And I think this is just one where we have to also engage our senior leadership because, again, sustainability and execution, we can create anything, but we got to be able to execute and sustain the execution. So I'll continue to work on it, but for now, I think will, and I'll also, as I said, have some discussions with our office directors, but I think we need the infrastructure before we start talking about specific corrections in that area.
When you say infrastructure, you mean what?
I mean that infrastructure that will allow us to operate predictably and responsibly and be able to sustain the approach. Rather, it's not dependent on an individual's personality. It is a part of the organizational infrastructure. And regardless to who the board members are or who the managers are, is going to continue to function and be the haven for decisions and why the board made them. We need somebody to establish that kind of infrastructure, in my mind. Now, you guys may disagree, but
Well, do you mean this is a person to lead this? Is that what you mean by infrastructure?
So as I've said to you, Mr. Chairman, and to the other board members, we need a correspondence manager. We need somebody who manages the board's correspondence. We have management of the staff correspondence. We don't have a manager for the board process. And it's one of the driving concerns expressed in the NAPA report. What happens is individual staff members end up in the middle of board negotiations. I think we need our own infrastructure to manage the process among the board members.
Okay, we're in the process right now of defining and advertising for the external affairs person. We had somebody in that position a couple of years ago, but it's a vacant position right now, and we're in the process as we go through defining the job description of including in that job description a responsibility for managing the board correspondence process. So is that going to scratch the itch that we need?
I sure hope so. That's what I've been advocating, and I think it's necessary.
Okay, I'm seeing
I agree.
three heads nodding. Okay. So we'll continue to pursue that one with urgency. Okay.
Can I come back?
Mr. Santos.
One thing we
Yep.
talked about is to have some type of notional timeline. So I said I was going to take the lead for the orange folder kind of draft. So I can do that in the next 2 weeks. So you can put that down.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we finished this concludes our discussion of the prior items on our punch list. I think it's a little early for a break, so what I'm going to suggest is that we go ahead to the next item on the agenda, which is going to be mine, and we discuss those, and then we can probably take a break after that. So the first new new agenda item is to discuss recommendations 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I'm just going to, they're all under the super title, Enhancing Collaboration with Stakeholders. So recommendation 5 is strengthen congressional engagement. Board members should enhance board reputation as a source of expertise and excellent oversight of defense nuclear facilities, increase the intensity and frequency of their meetings and outreach, getting into new rhythm of communication with Congress to ensure it is addressing nuclear safety concerns. Okay, we are actually in a pretty good position right now to reboot this process because right after the President's State of the Union address, the budget will come out, at which time traditionally we go to our oversight committees and brief our plans for the following fiscal year. So I see that as an opportunity not only to do just that, but also to kind of reset our relationship with them. There's some new members, particularly of the staff, that are involved, and so my intent is to be pretty aggressive about that after the State of the Union, is to getting that scheduled, and then also including a couple of other topics in that briefing, and then finding a sense from them on how frequently we want to come back during the year to discuss issues. So I think this is a good time to reboot that, and my proposal is that we put that under the category of mine for action, assigned to me for action, but I think we've got a good path ahead. Ms. Connery?
So I agree with what you're saying. I think we have to think a little bit broader than our oversight committees. I believe that we should make sure that we continue to maintain our relationships with the individual stakeholders. In other words, things happen in places. So where there are defense nuclear facilities, the membership on the Hill and their staff, say in Washington State or New Mexico, where we have a relationship with that staff, I think that's important to maintain. I would also suggest that when we get to the point of hiring an external affairs person, having professional staff go up. I also think that this is a good place to talk about rules of engagement, because right now we have each of us have personal relationships with certain members on the Hill. I think it's important, particularly with 140 and other challenges we have, to present a unified front when it comes to the conversations in the Hill. It was been past practice that board members would go up in twosies or foursies when presenting to the Hill. I think that's still a good idea. I think we also need to make sure that we empower the staff to have conversations without being too prescriptive, just about their observations, without drawing conclusions that the board has said anything about it. But a lot of times staffers just want to get educated about the facilities that are in their states. And I believe that our staff is perfectly capable of having those conversations with those stakeholders. And I think it's important to make sure that the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board is one of the go-to places where those staffers go to engage. I also think we need to bump up our game a little bit and start having FaceTime with some members about some of our issues and challenges, and not be content to have conversations with staff.
Let me ask you a question, because when we're talking about going up in pairs, I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with that, because I'm not sure that everybody's getting a voice, and we do have differences. Let me offer you a counter proposal, and that is that we do our best to go as a board and recognize in the process, and we can discuss this. I want to throw it out here. Let's say that two of us view it one way, and one of us views it another one way, and the fourth one doesn't care, which happens a lot. Would it be beneficial to provide the majority view to whoever the audience is, and then offer a minority opinion on it? I want to offer that thought.
Yeah, I have no objection to the board going up as a group. I just said to twosies because not everybody likes to go up to the Hill. So if 4 board members want to go up to the Hill, I think that's that's fantastic. It just takes 2 Ubers instead of 1. I mean, that's the only difference. But I just want to make sure that when we have those interactions, that it's not just one board member with Hill staff or with a member without a member of the professional staff and or other board members, just for the transparency's sake, because I think it protects that.
Okay,
individual.
I see what you're saying, but what I'm specifically talking about is the opportunity to brief something where there's a minority view. Is that something that we should stay away from, or is that something that we should do?
Well, in that all of us have a minority view on something sometime, I think we should distinguish between communicating just the facts and communicating on decisions of the board. I absolutely have no problem when we do meet with, which would be primarily staff, members sometimes, hopefully, that we shouldn't hide the ball. I mean, we post our opinions, so I don't think it's hiding the ball. I think the overriding decision of the board should be the overriding communication. That's all that I'm saying. I don't have any problem making it clear when there's a minority opinion. And Napa had some recommendations to that vein, which I like, which, I'm sure we'll get back around to as well, too. But I think the goal is for, at least in my mind, should be for me to be able to say the board wasn't unanimous on this. I'm just saying I don't think it takes all of us in every communication. And we should distinguish between when we're communicating the facts and when the board has made a decision on an action, which won't necessarily be the majority of the time in my mind.
I appreciate that, and I agree, and I appreciate the fact that you're saying, well, sometimes when there's a decision of the board and there's a minority opinion, the minority opinion ought to be heard, recognize that, hey, it wasn't a unanimous agreement on the board. So, okay, so we'll muddle through that a little bit to see if we can figure out a way to do it. Bringing on an external affairs and correspondence management person is, I think, the long-term solution to this, but hiring sometimes always takes longer than you want, so I'm not going to wait to get that person on board to start this next cycle of outreach.
Can I add one more comment, Mr. Hamilton? As a board member, I actually would feel better than having to communicate if I disagree with the position that the rest of you took myself than to have one of you communicate that, because what that means is we're actually communicating. If you can say, well, we had one dissenting opinion and here's why, I think that will engender more confidence than if we're just talking at somebody.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yep. Okay, so recommendation number 5. Oh, I'm sorry, you're not finished.
No, I was just going to say, if I'm happy to provide a list of people that I think we ought to go, whose doors we want to go knock on and work with you and general management to make that happen prior to the hiring of fictitious person number 6 or whoever it is.
So recommendation number 5 is assigned to me, and it is ongoing and not closed. It's on, what do we call it? Assigned for further action to me. Mr. Santos?
Yeah, I agree that we should be more active than passive and reset. And I know you're going to take some actions before we hire, but if we can have some sort of notional plan for all the different committees and members for the next, let's say, 6 months, that would be very helpful to me.
Recommendation number 6 is very similar. Bolster engagement with Department of Energy leaders. Board members should restart the board's relationship with key, DOE leaders who share nuclear safety oversight. Board as an entire group should hold summits and meetings with top leaders of DOE, including the Secretary and Deputy Secretary. Now, this is, I see this recommendation as kind of part of it is things that we can do, and part of it is things that we will have to offer, but can't force. So my view of this is part of this we are already doing by our informal discussions with the senior leadership in the DOE, and I'll continue to push that. But I'm offering I'm looking for any ideas on this one.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of these. I'm going to say the same thing about. I'm not sure what restart means. If restart means the full board having sessions, we've talked about that as it relates to the head of NNSA and the head of EM. And hopefully those will continue and will bear fruit as the board has done those for years, probably decades.
And I think part of that is because Napa didn't realize that we were doing that. So maybe part of that is a failure to recognize we already had something like that going on.
Well, and it has waffled over the years. It's there have been cases where it wasn't as strongly desired on either side, and so I think putting emphasis back on those is probably a good point. I'll just end it there.
I think more communication is always better. I'm afraid we're heading in the opposite direction, and we should look for opportunities to look for more communications with the key leaders. I understand the periodics. I think that's helpful. I don't think that's sufficient, in my opinion. We should look for other opportunities. I will have to look to council, but maybe as part of the draft recommendation process, we typically get feedback. Maybe we could take that as an opportunity to have more personal engagement with some of the leaders so we can explain some of our reasons. I understand their feedback on a more personal level. But throwing letters back and forth, it's just not going to work. I'm not happy how the 140 things is leading us to less communications. So I'm very open and look forward to opportunities to communicate. And I think it starts with the chairman. I think you are serving as a spokesperson of the agency. You should be more active in your talking to Secretary Perry, Deputy Secretary Mr. Burley, and others to make sure we keep them abreast of our work.
I was just going to say I agree with that. I think for it to be helpful, it has to not just be meaningful to us, but meaningful to them. But I would say in our formal processes, we need to make sure that we remember that the sun must shine. So when it comes to recommendations, we have to make sure that we are working with legal and that process is captured in the right legal framework. The other thing that I would say is we probably need to work better at making sure we all know what each other is communicating. Mm-hmm. I don't think we're very good at that. We all are individuals. We all have individual opinions. But when it comes to the agency's business, we should know what the message is.
So to that point, I again, you're the spokesperson. I know you're having some of the discussion. Some sort of summary or high level of what are the discussions are will go a long way to keep us informed and build a more strong communication. So I agree with your point.
Okay, so I'm going to hold this open. This is mine for. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. I agree we need a little bit more transparency when one of the board members is meeting or the chairman is meeting with the secretary, the deputy secretary, or even one of the -1s. It should be apparent to all of the board members just so that there is no suspicion or bad feeling that comes out of it after the fact. And obviously unification of message. So I actually was intrigued by this whole idea of a summit, which I think everybody kind of snickered at when they read it. But aside from the silly word, I think it would probably, and it's probably not for now, and it's probably something when the staff gets engaged that we should consider is, we had NA50 come over and talk about their kind of new philosophy or their new charge when it comes to nuclear safety. I think having those dialogues at staff and board level about the issues of nuclear safety in general and the approaches to it is crucially important. And that's something that we can do, in a meeting format. It doesn't have to be, how we normally do it. Or it's, we could consider something a little bit more public where we actually talk about views about how to approach nuclear safety. But we have been out, I think, as an agency, out of the habit of engaging on that broad topic in public with our counterparts at DOE and with other safety agencies. And I think it would behoove us to kind of move back in and recognize that amongst our staff, we do have significant expertise in this area, and we should be exchanging views on the topic in general and not just on particular letters that get sent back and forth, to Dan's point.
Okay, I've got this for action. Let's keep going with the recommendation 7, which is to engage with public interest groups. And it's kind of curious. It says board members should continue their practice of holding an annual hearing for interest groups. I'm not aware that we have a practice of holding annual hearing for interest groups. We just have had hearings, and public interest groups have been encouraged to join and make statements. But I don't know that we've had a practice of an annual hearing.
I'm not aware of that in the life of the board.
Is this something we should do?
I mean, we get briefed by special interest groups, and they get posted on our website, and some of the groups come periodically. So maybe they meant briefing instead of hearing, but I'm not aware of a hearing. I do feel, though, that I think just similar to strengthening congressional engagement, we should also strengthen some approach to other groups, especially like to your point, near defense nuclear facilities, they're local governments, they're local communities. We're not doing a good enough of a job of informing of what are we doing, what are the value that we're bringing on some of the things. And I think we ought to include, whether it's part of the new hire, new duties, but us collectively also, not just congressional engagement, but what I call local governments and local community engagement, as well as other interest groups. How to go about that? There's many ways we could do it, and they can range from periodic public meetings at each site where we discuss the oversight of activities of the board and the findings, and then we provide an opportunity for public comment. We can have meetings with some of those community and governments. We're just not doing that, and we ought to be doing some of that. That's just my opinion.
Anybody else? I'm trying to get my arms around what we really want to do here, because it's kind of squishy right now in my head.
I agree with Dan that we should explore some of those ideas, and so maybe the tasker is, when we get somebody from external affairs on board, we sit down and have a conversation about those kind of bigger ticket items. I think small, easy wins. Whenever we go out to sites, we should make it, individually, board members should make the commitment to make themselves available to public interest groups and to local governments. I think that is also a direction that probably needs to be provided to the staff to make sure that we have the contact folks so that they get in the habit of doing it when we go out to sites.
So maybe we're crunched for time, but we have an upcoming public hearing at Albuquerque. Maybe that's an opportunity to do a small win and maybe intentionally reach out to some of the local governments and some of the groups and probably offer them the ability to come talk to the board prior to the meeting or during the meeting, but actually take that step. I'm just floating ideas.
I think that's a good idea, not just because you came up with it, Mr. Santos, but because we actually have letters from citizens group asking us to do that as well too. So I think I think the practice, I'm not aware of an annual hearing, but the board, and I think it was a best practice for the board, was to make sure it gave adequate notice to whether it's local government officials or citizens groups, when not just individual trips, but if, for instance, there's a hearing at Los Alamos, that there's an opportunity afforded in advance to also hear from those stakeholders who have an interest as well. And I think we have kind of fallen off the wagon. We haven't really maintained, this is my word today, the infrastructure to be consistent and predictable in doing that. And we need to reinvigorate.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is, unlike what the recommendation says, we don't have a practice of holding annual hearings like this. And I'm not hearing an interest that we start such a practice. Rather, what I'm hearing is we should reinvigorate what we've already been doing, which is we're always open to having public interest groups come and visit with us here. We just had one last week, I guess it was. We should be more rigorous about making sure that public interest groups know that we're going to have an open session at the end of a hearing for them to make statements. So we're doing those things. We just need to be more active and conscious about doing them, but we don't need to do an annual hearing.
I think it's in between that. I think it's not just reinvigorating what we've already done. And when I say we, I say this board, right? But it's not doing an annual hearing for the interest groups. What we are not in the practice of doing is we are not in the practice of meeting when we go out to sites consistently with public interest groups. We do it here and there, but we don't do it consistently. We have not, as a board, kind of put something out there to say we're going to be in Albuquerque having a hearing, but there are people that maybe want to just present to the board and not in a public hearing. So we could just sit in a room with, and have interest groups talk to us.
You and I have done that in the past.
Yeah.
Particularly our first year.
Right. But I didn't hear you describe that piece of it in kind of your recap. We have, but it is not a matter of course, and it was, I think, as an introduction to the site, not that every time you go to a site you should make that happen.
Okay. So is this a commitment by us to do that when we make trips? Is that the way we resolve this?
There's the individual aspect of it, which is, okay, if I'm going to go to a trip, I'm going to make a conscious effort and work with the staff to make sure I extend an invitation and open willingness to meet with local governments and special interest group. I think I can only speak for myself on that one. Every individually going to make their decision. I think it will be a positive step, in addition to when we have a formal board trip, like a hearing or meeting, to do the invitations, and whether it's to speak at the meeting or outside of the meeting. What I'm also floating out there to think about is, I probably want to take it a little bit step further, is, hey, maybe we want to consider having not annual, but periodic, and it could be, pick the periodicity, years, months, whatever, to have meetings at each of the defense nuclear facilities or hearings where we describe the work of the board and allow the local communities and governments to come ask questions of our work. So that's a step that we have not done. That's taking it a step further. I'm supportive of that. It's just an idea to float out.
Do you mean like a public meeting? Because
it would be like
seems like we ask questions.
Correct. Correct. It's like a forum. I don't know what to call it. It will have to be a meeting. Okay. But it's like, hey, let's say
do a deep dive on.
Yeah, it's like a deep dive where we go to Y12 and we describe, the work done by our residents, the work done by our staff at headquarters, the areas of interest. We hear from the OE, the contractor. We hear from the special interest group. We have an opportunity to meet with the local governments. We're just more proactive in our communications, and we do that periodically through, the sites. I don't need we're not decision time or anything like that. I'm just throwing out an idea that I think should be considered as you go through acting on this recommendation. So I just don't want to get that lost.
Okay.
Yes. So I agree with that. I wouldn't even put that in the hearing meeting. I would say a board briefing.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be the board, actually.
Good point.
I think there is value to doing that. And I think we have had a significant turnover in staff, whereas it's at just a couple of our sites now. We have resident inspectors that have been long-term resident inspectors and are known by the local, whether it's elected officials or citizen groups, who to call. I think we could benefit from raising the profile just a little bit at all the sites in the field.
I agree with that, and maybe that's something that we look at in terms of performance plans of resident inspectors as outreach as part of your performance plan, which it probably is already, but I'm not entirely sure of that. The one thing I would caution with the kind of idea of the periodically going out to a site and doing a deep dive like that is, I think it's a fantastic idea. What I'm worried about is that at this point in time, with the number of staff we have and the number of initiatives that we're taking, we don't want, that's an important aspect of our work. We can't let that overshadow the actual work that gets done in terms of reviews and what have you. So I just think we need to be conscious of how much we bite off and how many staff we have to chew on particular initiatives.
Let me offer this, because I'm trying to put, I mean, we got a bunch of ideas floating around here, but I haven't got a concrete thing to do. So let me offer this. Maybe we should put together a schedule, site by site, where, you know, we haven't been as rigorous in the past year about board member site visits as we have maybe in the past. Maybe that's the key to doing this, is getting, and I asked the technical director to put together a calendar year 19 schedule. Maybe we ought to tie it to that set of visits, so that for each one of those that we schedule, and be more rigorous to make sure we get every one covered during this year, that we include in that a visit to the local interest groups.
No disagreement, but I also think we ought to take advantage. One thing that we did used to do is ECA host all come once a year, I think a week or more, whatever, and we used to take that as an opportunity to tell them what the board was focused on. I think they usually have that here. So all that I'm saying is there are specific activities that we could consider as not just when we go out. We should look for those forums where we can communicate what priorities we have and hear back from people as well, too.
So I agree with, I think it's a good start, what you described, and that gives you some more concrete things about it. To address Ms. Connery's concern, I like the idea of Ms. Robertson. Maybe we start with briefing, where we're just informing the work we're already doing, as opposed to creating the much more work and involvement that is involved with having a hearing or a meeting. So I think we can tailor it at the appropriate size to your concern. And I agree with your point that there's other forums, and as you know, there's other places. You're going to give a talk coming up. You do talks. There's forums. There's places we can give speeches. Other forums we can attend. And hopefully through the new hire, external affairs, we can have a clear identification of all of those and put it as part of our plans. So
Okay, I've got this for action. I am not going to continue our practice of holding annual hearings that we don't have, but I am going to include in the plan of the year for staff visits that whoever goes to each of these sites reaches out to the local community, and I am going to look for opportunities that Mr. Santos just described, such as the ECA annual event, where we can make a presentation of the things we're working on. Okay. So I've got that. The last one, recommendation 8, is really not for us. It's for the Department of Energy, and it's to respond positively to DNSFB efforts to enhance engagement. The board's ability to carry out its mission would be greatly facilitated by the DOE's full level of support in kind, and it goes quite on more in detail here. This is an action item for the DOE, and the only thing I'm going to do with this is ensure that the departmental representative knows that it exists, and I'm going to consider that. I don't know that there's not an action for us. So does anybody have any comments on this?
I think we cover a little bit on recommendation 6. It takes two to communicate, right? So we need that continued dialogue, and we need to continue to remain open to a productive dialogue. So.
Okay, well, that one's mine for action to make sure that that's the second part of the dialogue. That's their side. Kind of goes hand in glove with recommendation 6. We're going to take a bio break. So we will break for, let's say, 10 minutes, and we'll restart at 11:25 by that clock right there. Thank you. All right, we are reconvening, and we're going to go to recommendation number 9, led by Ms. Connery.
So this will be very quick because recommendation 9 says prioritize strategic planning and strategic goals, which I believe that the board members around the table have already committed to. I do want to mention a few things that it says specifically. One mention that the NAPA recommendation makes is to ensure that sufficient staff members are focused on strategic planning. My hope and intention when we engage with the outside parties is to, again, kind of spread this out over time. One of the challenges that I mentioned before and some of the other initiatives that we're taking is that it is difficult with the size of our staff to maintain the appropriate level of oversight to do our mission, as well as to engage in these very necessary activities to refocus the agency where it needs to be focused. And this was a challenge I found with the NAPA report, where it said that we have fewer documents out, and yet at the same time we have to do all of this work. So recognizing we have a finite staff, I think that we have to take that into consideration whenever proposing new activities. And obviously the mission takes primacy, but I think the strategic plan has to be of equal primacy in order to understand where we're going to go in the future. So my request to the board is to be patient and to put that emphasis where it needs to be. Obviously, resources will be redirected in the event of any kind of emerging activity, as it always is. It also mentions the tapping of senior-level nuclear safety experts to report directly to the chair and have a dotted line relationship with the new executive director of operations. Again, I don't think that we need to go into the infrastructure at this point in time, but I do think that we have to recognize that the board has to signal that this is important to it by allowing senior staff who are going to be working on it the time to put the effort into it. Again, the reporting doesn't really hurt my head. This is not an area in which you're necessarily leading at this point in time, although if you would like me to hand it off to you at any point, I'm happy to do so. But a commitment from the chair is going to be extremely important at the time when we get this rolling, to signal to the staff that this is not not a check-the-box item that we're doing because NAPA told us to, but it's something that we are all going to invest time and energy in.
Okay, and I will tell you right now that this is something I fully support. The challenges we've had with strategic planning in the past have not been areas of disagreements of commission. They've been of omission. It's just that we haven't been as rigorous. I appreciated your work last year trying to get this thing going, but I do fully support the initiative, and we just need to get some rubber traction on the ground and make it happen.
as you said, we spoke of this earlier. I'm supportive. We should move on, and I'm willing to pitch in, help, do whatever, but I am 100% supportive.
Same here.
Okay, so number 9, prioritize strategic planning and strategic goals. Ms. Connery's got the lead, and more action to follow, all part of the strategic planning process. Item number 10, maintain a unified agenda. And item number 10 is going to be led by Mr. Santos.
Like you recognize in your opening statements, there's several recommendations that are related, and we're just going to go through them and we're going to look at them again, and we have to step back and look at it. I think I'm going to do 10 and 11, and while I'm going to break them down and so we can have a discussion, some of the issues underlying the recommendations, I think they have common threats to them, and as we work to address those common areas, I think we will be also taking care of like some of these recommendations. So when it comes to 10, 11, I think we're going to talk about 12. I think as we come up with new infrastructures, whether it's a new EDO, for example, as we look at ways to improve our clear and periodic and more open two-way communications with the staff, as we communicate better our expectations regarding the standards of work, the quality we expect from the work of the staff, and roles and responsibilities, will go a long way to address some of these recommendations. That's my preliminary analysis. But having said that, we'll go through each one and I'm breaking down. So 10, board members should ensure that all staff conducted reviews are of the highest quality. Absolutely, I consider that part of my primary role, and I know you all make sure that the collective agency product are of the highest quality and technical integrity before they leave this agency. But right now we are relying too heavily in the folder process, and in some cases where we're not satisfied with quality, we just simply vote it down and call it the end of the road, and we're missing a great opportunity to have more dialogue and an understanding of what are our expectations of what is the additional work that needs to be done. So I guess it's tied up to we need to improve our communications with staff. We need to do a better job of communicating our expectations regarding quality of work before we get to the end. So my hope is as we improve our communications and expectations, that could be addressed. But I am confident that the work that it does go out is of the highest quality. Any comments on that? So I don't see any action outside. We need to tie this to improving our communications, improving our correspondence process, so we can deal with that and continue to ensure that products go out of the highest quality. Any comments?
So I actually like the idea of looking at when a piece of correspondence fails, doing a little bit of analysis as to why it failed. Sometimes it's going to fail because it's the wrong vehicle. Sometimes it's going to fail for other reasons. In the past, when a product has failed, a board member would have to champion to put it into a different package. So if it was, potentially a potential recommendation and that wasn't going to go forward, so it became a tech report, or if it was, or goes out as an info paper versus a reporting requirement or what have you. And we've salvaged some work that way, but I think you're right. We've lost other work that should potentially be communicated to the Secretary of Energy. So I'm a full proponent of having in the interim before we fix the folder process, perhaps coming up with a way to address a failed product with the technical director and the board to determine whether or not that product could be rehabilitated or reworked or in some cases, if it's incomplete, if there's another review that would need to take place for us to be satisfied that it's a complete piece of work for us to do that. Because I think the failure, particularly when, which I think is why the notational voting at one point was helpful when it wasn't weaponized, was to tell the staff, I didn't vote for it, but not because it's not good work, but for this reason. But if we're voting something down and they don't know what the reason is, they're never going to be able to, learn what the issue was with it or fix that product. So I think that there's an interim step that we could take there. I'll stop for now and get reaction to that.
I'm good with it. Yeah. I think there's something, and I also think it's a check on both what the staff communicated and our understanding of what was received, too. So I agree. I think sometimes things go down, and they should get a second chance, and we don't do it. So I'm supportive.
This is a good opportunity to, it's a little sidebar discussion, but I think it's a good opportunity to have it because this recommendation says unified board work plan. We don't have a, what's that?
I'll get there. Keep going.
Am I stealing your thunder? You want to? Okay, this is actually a sidebar, so I don't think it'll steal your thunder. But there are at least 3 occasions in the last year where I have done something as chief executive in the absence of a board direction. The 2020 budget submittal, the OTD work plan for 2019, and the performance metrics, which were early on last year. The performance metrics thing. Yeah, I'm sorry?
Yes.
The part that goes with the PAR. And my view on these sorts of things, as compared with staff products, which just don't go forward, my view on these sorts of things is that these sorts of things are necessary for the railroad to keep running. I will do what the board wants to do. The law says the chairman shall be the chief executive subject to such policies as the board enacts or makes. So I will always do what the board wants to do, but if the board chooses not to act, which is a failed vote, then I still have to submit the budget. And so I will do the best I can to try to discern the right answer. It's not because I'm trying to take power, it's that I've got to keep the railroad running. So when that happens, it puts me in a little bit of a bad spot because I'm having to go out there and do something on my own, and I don't like doing that. So I just want to kind of clear the air with everybody. We've talked about this before, and everybody knows those 3 cases. But I'm more than willing to go back and, in this particular case, the work plan, go back and let's get it right if it's not right. But I can't get the budget right because it was due, and the train's already gone down the track. So that's what I'm doing on those things. So, Mr. Santos.
So you derailed me. Okay. And I was going to bring this up on recommendation 11, but it's a good point. I appreciate the open discussion. For me, we just need additional dialogue and communications. I had communicated, for example, some of the reasons of some of the issues I had with the documents, but there was no additional dialogue or process for which I could find a way to move forward, and then you just moved forward. So I understand what you're saying. I think we have work to do. I look forward for our team building activities and ways to improve that, but we need more communications to make sure that every board member is heard and their needs are addressed, which it just wasn't the case.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with any of that. This kind of goes back to, I think the point you're making is acting more like a team, and we've got to work on that more.
The only thing I'd add is, and you correctly characterized our conversation in the past, is we also, there's no reason we can't be in a position where we're discussing what our next proposed budget is, no matter when it is. And so I think sometimes it feels like things are pushed to the end to run over the board, not you specifically. So we need to pull back and have a real schedule so that there's meaningful time left in the process for board member to board member communication if they are to die for issues. That's what I would say.
But my point was about staff product, not necessary. I mean, I understand the.
It's a different topic.
Right,
I just
okay.
wanted to, that's why I said it was a sidebar
Okay, I
issue.
wanted to
just
clarify.
I wanted to use the opportunity to clear the air on that.
But where there is overlap is the issue of when something fails by vote, that should not be the last conversation about it. And I think that's where the process fell apart for the budget. I supported the work plan, so that wasn't my issue. But I think that good faith effort, and this unfortunately falls on your shoulders because you're the chairman, good faith effort after a failed vote to go see what would it have taken to satisfy what you wanted and then do that negotiation. And we've done that painstakingly on a couple of products recently, and I've been the one kind of trying to do that, and it's not easy or pretty, but I think we have to give the importance of that weight, and we have to take the time to do it, even if it's not necessarily palatable.
So I agree with you, Ms. Connery, and I like Ms. Robertson talk about infrastructure, and you asked about we come up with new processes. I think this should be one to take into consideration. I think you should take it for lead, you as the chairman. I think you're in the best position of all of us to, once a product by whether it's the staff or board level fails, that there's some sort of, redress and understanding why it failed. Is there anything else can be done? Is it an issue of quality, completeness, or what have you? So I think you should take this one for action.
The orange folder appeals process. One of the things that, while we're on this topic, because this is really not the recommendation, but while we're on this topic, it would be helpful in going through one of these where there's a disagreement and a failure. It would be helpful if there were amendments during the yellow folder so that I would know what the problems are. So I know not everybody likes to do amendments. But I don't think this is probably not the right time to deliberate on this one. But absent an amendment, I don't, it gets to the blue folder level, and I don't know what the beef was until it fails. So anyway, I'll just throw that out there. I'm a little concerned that we're getting away from Mr. Santos's tag items, but I did derail it, so that's my fault.
So I appreciate the fact that you're deviating from your number scheme, because I know that was challenging for you. I don't think the amendment is the solution. I think that's what we're saying, is that amendments are absence of communication, right? So you're basically dropping a bomb on your other board members, or what was your record, 24 of them? That then they have to deal with in individual form and then in entirety. And that's really part of the challenge is, what is it that's going to meet your needs? And it may not be an amendment. There may be something behind it that needs to be explained further. But unless you go and engage that board member and find out the reason behind why they voted, it might not be as simple as an amendment, or it could be, or their amendment could cause somebody else not to vote for it. So you have to understand the rationale behind the challenge that board member's having.
Yeah, and I think you and I agree that amendments should not be surprise bombs. But there are always going to be cases where a document gets to the yellow folder process, and I want happy and you want glad, and I want puppy and you want small dog, and we know it. we know it in advance that there's a gap between our view, and so that's when the amendment process, that's what that's for. And so I couldn't agree with you more that surprise amendments are not helpful, but that doesn't necessarily mean amendments are bad in their own right. Okay, I got us off on this track, and I'd really like to get back on.
You
but
sure you don't want to keep going down this track?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
I really want to get back to where we're supposed to be.
So before I go back, I do think that they should take, listed as for action. We can have table it, but we should take the lead of when something is, fail, do an assessment of that. And I think you should lead that. So.
Well, that's not an issue, a recommendation in this punch list, but that's a fair request.
Thank you. It says that we're still on 10. Board members must then decide what significance to give to the review findings and determine the appropriate course of action, parentheses, recommendation process, reporting requirements for the DOE, etc. So two points of that. I agree. That's one of the things I've been trying to champion. Have a more predictable, a more disciplined way where we can communicate the significance we give to the different findings. So I see an aspect that should be part of the strategic planning, as I mentioned and Ms. Connery talked about, and NAPA recognized. There's got to be a way for us to be more predictable in communicating our strategic safety issues that affects the whole defense complex. Which ones are more critical? What's like our risk approach to things? But at the lower levels, I think we are making some progress. And we have to get more runtime on it. When we issue policy statement 7, where the staff goes perform their reviews, they come up with what they consider potential safety items, and they rank, whether they think it ought to raised at different levels, whether it's a recommendation or a reporting requirement. And then they present their evidence, their independent technical analysis, and then we make the final determination whether that's a safety issue that we should carry forward. So through that process, I think we are going to be more transparent in providing and deciding what significance to give to the review findings and how we're acting. But I'm open to suggestions if you feel you need anything more than PS7 and some of the work we're going to do through the strategic plan.
I'd take a little less of PS7, but that's just me. I think there's a point where we overly prescribe, and the fact is that things don't necessarily fit into neat little boxes. So I understand that the desire, and I support the desire, but nothing. I think we can get tripped up with lexicon and miss the actual safety concerns just because we're in the process of labeling them. So I would just say we need to. That's a good guideline, and that's what, to me, the policy statement should be, as a high-level guideline. But the staff needs to be able to communicate their work in their way.
I agree.
I actually don't have any comments specific to what you just said. I think we have a recommendation a little bit later in the process about the extreme procedure writing that we have, and I think all of these things are subject to future deliberations.
That's a
Person.
that's a good point, and we need to talk about board policies, high level, and everything else that exists at the staff level, and how to really
re-engineer.
Right. But from a high level, I just want to say I recognize and support that we need to be transparent and clear and predictable regarding on how and what significance we're giving to the review findings. I think we're doing some of that, and we should continue to do that. So I have no further action at this point.
Okay, is this, but this is not a closed item, this is on hold? What is this, number 10?
To me, the only aspect remaining are strategic planning. There'll be an aspect that looks at strategic safety issues and communication. And the other aspects of it, will be tied to when we talk about the relationship between policies and staff procedures.
Are you going to address the RFBA piece of this or no?
I'm going to get to that. I'm going.
Okay, so what I'm really trying to...
No, I'm not done with 10. I'm going through each what I consider
Okay, so you're still
subs.
working on 10.
Yes.
Okay, what I'm trying to do is help the general counsel figure out how to make this into her spreadsheet.
I have 10. So basically, I guess we've done 3 subs. 1, 2, and the one that's not really 10, but you took for action.
We're not concluding that one in
Yeah,
here.
that's right. So, any more? Is it clear? Okay. Board members and board staff members should work from a unified agenda work plan that implements the priorities on which board members choose to focus. We just kind of touched on that, but we're not having success with this. I mean, we don't have an approved, work plan. But I wholeheartedly agree that should be our goal. We must have a unified agenda that implements the priorities on which board members focus. Right now, we have a very bottom-up approach, and we need to find a way to kind of meet in the middle. And I don't think we've done a good enough job of providing very clear priorities as a unified, board to the staff. So more work to be done, and I look forward to kind of round 2 of the work plan and see where we go.
Is this, going back to what Ms. Connery has been talking about, part of the flow from the strategic plan to these other plans?
It should. To me, it should. But then the issue with that will be the timing of it, because we're not ready. So this might take a while till we get there. Ms. Connery, any comments? Yeah. For board members should limit the use of additional RFBA tasking to address emergency situations and emergency. I agree. I mean, we must empower the staff to continue to be responsive to address all issues as they emerge, and don't wait for the board members to necessarily initiate action. I think there's misalignments in the sense of urgency and expectations. And again, I think we need to correct that through improved communications with the staff. And recently we made I think we're getting to a better way that we were, several, months ago, where some of the misalignments were being handled via RFBAs as opposed to a more organic process. So the aspect, if we look at the whole voting process and the whole correspondence could be addressed, I don't think we have such an issue right now that we're just continue to use too much RFBA to direct, big chunks of the work. But I'll take your perspective.
No, I'm going to wait to the next point.
I think if you look, I think RFBAs have been a source of contention between and amongst board members and between amongst board members and staff for a while. I would say that the height of the RFBA, I went back and looked at the RFBAs, and I would say that the height of the RFBA wars was probably about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. I would say in recent times, if you look at it, there have been fewer RFBAs that were directed at workflow. And again, the RFBA came about because a board member had a particular issue that he or she wanted to move forward, and then put it before the board to move forward. There may be other ways to deal with that process, and maybe if the RFBA process is not a good way because there's no real feedback loop there. We have periodic reviews of the work plan in which the staff comes up and tells us what they're doing and what they're not doing, and we could use that to realign the staff if the timing coincides, rather than using an RFBA process. That's just my preference.
What I think I just heard you say, and I agree with you, it seemed like there was a peak of RFPA frequency a little over a year ago, and in the last year it's subsided substantially. I don't have the data to tell me what the numbers are, but anecdotally, I think you're absolutely right. Part of the challenge could be addressed through our code of conduct, where we are more rigorous about making sure that we have talked amongst each other before we submit an RFPA. There's a footnote in here about bringing back this requirement. I'm not sure that I would want to revisit that, but I think that in a code of conduct area where we have a soft agreement that we should try to work these things out amongst ourselves before we submit RFPAs, I think that would be very helpful. I don't know why the RFPA frequency dropped off a year ago. It just did. Does anybody know?
Oh, I don't know if it dropped off because of, people throwing their hands up out of desperation or ineffectual. I don't know. What I would say is the RFPA process, yellow folder process, amendment process, all were born out of board member frustration that they were not able to affect the path of the staff work. And I think they were emblematic of the board not being able to communicate and work together. And so their sustainable need, to me, is a metric of how much progress we are not making.
But wasn't it also a requirement that was driven by when we got the IG in 2012?
The generation of procedures was a requirement when we got the IG, but the development and refinement of these processes were in response to specific board member concerns about their ability to shape the direction and priority of the work. Just like the work plan was born out of that same time frame too. But I think they were voting processes instituted because the collaborative and collegiate process wasn't necessarily working as well as it could and should.
So what I've just heard you say, and this is very interesting, is that the collegial and collaborative process broke down, a set of procedures was put in place to address that breakdown, and then as new board members, and the three of us, namely Santos, Connery, and I came along, those board procedures were in place, and that was just the way it was. Very interesting.
That's correct.
So I think another aspect of the RFBA process, again, I agree wholeheartedly with Jesse. It's a breakdown in collegiality. It's the kind of the push and pull of the work plan. I think the other, I'm one of those people who thinks that our work planning was over-engineered for a time period. It's gotten a little bit better, but it's still a little bit over-engineered because you have to respond to emergent actions. I have no problem with using an RFBA to address an emerging situation, but we shouldn't have to because with the communication between the board and the staff on our Tech Tuesdays or what have you, there should be an indication that is an emergent issue, and we're going to put staff resources on it. And then, to me, it should be up to the technical staff what resources to take off on. When the problems come about for me is the fact that we have a collection of very demanding board members when it comes to information on specific technical issues, and when that results in having to do an RFBA to do additional technical work that pulls work away from other prioritization, then you have a tension between the work plan that everybody agreed to and the needs of one or two board members who have a need for additional information without the collective saying, yes, there's a need to address those issues, and therefore you get frustrations with RFBAs or counter RFBAs on workforce. the smaller our workforce gets, the more tension there's going to be on what it is that board members want them to look at. So in this case, size matters, and the size of your staff is going to matter when it comes to how you're going to prioritize the work products.
The other thought on this, because I think this is a very interesting discussion, is if collegiality broke down, resulted in the creating of processes and procedures, which then maintained the breakdown even after personalities changed. In the absence of those procedures, you are really relying on the personalities of the board members themselves, and we can't be guaranteed that we're always going to have the great and reliable and friendly four board members that we are for the future. I mean, I'm being cynical, but we're relying on that if we don't have those processes and procedures. So I'm not sure if it's a trap that we can get out of.
But you're guaranteeing you won't if you have those processes and procedures in place.
Well, maybe, but you just said we've had a real dearth of RFBAs over the last year, which I think is a healthy sign.
But Jesse's point was that could be a healthy sign, or it could be a sign of the dysfunction seeking to the point where people just are not bothering to do RFBAs because they don't see them going forward.
I think it's worth focusing, and I don't know in what form we focus on. I would put this in the bucket with what I call notational voting correspondence process. It's because I understand what you're saying. Every board member should be able to shape through some process the direction of the agency. I think the consequences are significant because, once again, you're right. It can be a self-fulfilling prophecy in that, and we've all heard it, well, the board member can do an amendment or an RFBA. It does not contribute to not just collegiality among us, but a productive set of interactions between us and the staff. And so something needs to change. That's all that I'm saying. I don't know what it is.
I agree, change is needed, and you can see how I prefaced the whole thing with communications process, all of that. I have witnessed how every one of us have modified the approach to doing our work because of some of these issues. So I think some of the numbers going down is because we have found different ways to approach, our work, not necessarily that there's some now great alignment or great communications happening. So more work to do. I just don't want us to get lost that numbers going down equals things are good.
So I don't want to foreshadow number 12, but we've had a couple of conversations about having an EDO. That only works, in my view, if all the board members put their faith in that EDO and that the recruitment process for that person gets a top-notch person in whom we all have considerable faith. There is no person I know who is going to want to operate at that level and feel like they actually can run their staff and their resources if they are subject to the whim of an RFBA week. It's just not going to happen.
RFBA what?
A week.
A week, okay.
Right. So while I understand that every board member has to be heard, we need to figure out that amongst ourselves. But if the board is going to support an EDO, I believe we have to support that person with the understanding that they're the ones that run the staff and the processes, and we are very clear about what the expectations are of that person and how those processes are run. And sure, there might be emergency switches that we put in there, as in any case, but if the board procedures allow for me as the EDO to have my plan derailed, haphazardly, then I know I'm walking into a broken system, and I don't think we're going to get the caliber of the person that we want to be in that position.
You just derailed me. No. Listen, I agree. I do agree that we also have to be realistic that things occur as time passes on, and we have to have a better way of making sure, because we're all different. I mean, you can take the same problem, and each one of us looks at that same problem differently. So we have to figure out how we're going to work amongst ourselves to make sure that nobody gets left out. And I do agree with that. I think that's where this process should be. It's actually through these defined processes, which, as I told Ms. Connery when we put some of them in place, my vote comment was, I'm willing to try. And then because some of these we didn't put in place until 15. The procedures went into effect, but as time went on and board members felt disconnected from the work, then these processes started to be installed. But I think it is, at the end of the day, still a measure of how we listen to each other and how we understand our differences and work together. I don't know how to say it any differently.
I agree. That's what I said. Some of these recommendations, I think, will go a long way as we improve our working as a unit, as more of a team, as opposed to just a collection of the individual thoughts. So let's move.
Can I just make one last statement? Because it goes to Mr. Hamilton's point about the procedures being in place, and then we might always be a collegiate board. The fact of the matter is that when the procedures aren't working for us, we deviate from them anyway, collegially. We say, okay, we're going to put in unanimous consent to stop that procedure because we need to do something different. So if we didn't have those procedures and we had to put one in place for a particular contingency, we could put them in. But right now, it's kind of we're in opposite world where we have these layers of procedures, and when an emergency comes around, we deviate from the procedures.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I don't agree that using unanimous consent is a deviation from procedures, because it is a procedure.
My point is to suspend other procedures, right? That's what I'm saying, is that there's always a way around the procedures,
Yeah.
or without going through the board, just altering work practices.
Let me think about that. Yeah, I'll cogitate. Go ahead, Mr. Santos.
Are we done with 10? Let's go to 11. There's several thoughts and themes are 11, but I go back to this one. It clearly says revert to a traditional organizational staffing dynamic. The board members should revert to a more traditional staffing model to better allow the board's SES members to lead, its directors to direct, the board supervisors to supervise, and its problems resolved at the lowest possible level. So I'm going to start with a question to Ms. Robertson, because the word used is revert. So,
Yeah, I read through this. That's in my recollection. The board members, especially for the technical organization, has always had a role to play. I mean, it's a specialty class of technical people. And I think the previous boards were very smart at ensuring that they had the opportunity to have skin in the game when it came to ensuring that the few technical experts they could have were people they had skin in the game in. So I don't know what revert means to either. As far as it says board member, the way I read this is board members should just say bye-bye and, it just kind of happens. I think we have a specialty class of technical people for a reason, and I actually don't know what revert means.
I don't know what revert means either.
okay. It says board members should ensure that they and staff members divide their activities to align with their respective roles, holding strategic, more tactical matters respectively. So when I went through it, I just pulled out what I thought were the sub-recommendations. yes, again, I think some of these are all tied to, as we come up with improving communications, we really have to better communicate what the roles and responsibilities of the board, of the staff, and the interactions. We have to do that. We haven't really done that messaging as a collective body. And I think that will go a long way to solve some of these issues identified. Ms. Connery?
I'm just going to repeat my earlier point about the EDO. So this describes a situation in which the staff is, their words, micromanaged, and states that the board members have to balance their technical focus on one hand with strategic considerations on the other hand, which I don't think that anyone around this table would disagree with. The involvement in the day-to-day business gets a little bit tricky just because the technical work is our business. So as Ms. Robertson said, it's difficult to separate. But I think how we define the role of the EDO and his or her responsibility vis-a-vis the staff is going to be imperative to get this balance right. And the board members may have to adjust their understanding of what their roles are vis-a-vis the staff in that instance.
So again, I think there's an element that will tie to recommendation 12. I agree with that. We should talk about it. But as we come up with describing that balance, I like that word, and how we have to adjust the roles is important. But I also agree with the observation that the technical work is our work, and that there's a nature to that will require some type of engagement, more than a more hands-off kind of approach. So I agree. We have to look and then come up with a communication strategy for the staff on how we're going to be operating moving forward. Involvement of all board member areas, of all board members in certain areas, like hiring and firing of various agency directors, can distract board members from addressing other important policy and mission issues and lead to divisions among staff members. The recommendation is the board should pursue legislative changes with the Congress to implement this recommendation. This confused me because a paragraph later in recommendation 12 starts, board members should appoint an executive director for operations. So I'm confused. Any thoughts on that? I think our statute is clear, and if there's any potential modifications to that, we should put it in the bin. We're going to work with the general counsel and deal with this particular one through that process.
So I would make the observation that personnel is policy. And in the case of a small agency such as ourselves, particularly people on whom we depend who are in high levels of responsibility at the currently that's our technical director, our general manager, and our general counsel. I think that is a collective board duty to be able to hire and fire those individuals, because we have to have buy-in to those individuals. Below that, I think I understand what they're saying, which is that the SESs should be making decisions with regards to who their direct reports are going to be, and that decision process. I will relay a conversation with Ms. Roberson's position that she and I had earlier, because I was of the mind, because when I got here, board members weren't involved in staff level hiring, and we were only involved in the senior level hiring, and we had there was actually a near miss of a potentially disastrous hire in one of those top 3 positions that I will tell you about offline, that had the board members made that decision before I got on board, we would have fallen into a very bad situation. So I believe that in those positions, the board members should be involved. On the staff level, I didn't think it was that important. I thought it was more important that the technical staff was comfortable with who they were hiring. Ms. Roberson made the point, which changed my mind a little bit about that, which was that if the staff members or people who are applying to join the staff had to interview with each of the board members, then the board members would have a vested interest in that individual and a connection to that individual. So when it came time for the technical work to be done and that person to be sitting across from us in the boardroom, the board members would feel a connection to that staff member I'm speaking on the technical side in particular, that would engender a trust in some of the more sensitive work that we do. And I hadn't considered that before, and I actually think that is a good point that NAPA didn't take into consideration.
I'm just going to offer a very short comment on your previous question, and I generally agree with most of what you said there. I think there's a muddled message in some of this.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But the only thing I was going to add to what Ms. Connery said, which I don't know, most of you should know, is the board actually halted its engagement in that process because I asked them to. In the spring of 2015, when we had 2 new board members coming on board, and we only had 3 board members, and we had a lot of stuff going on, I actually formally asked the other 2 board members to halt that until the new board members showed up. And so we never revisited that practice, and we've never really resolved this. Yeah, it was a temporary halt.
Then why didn't it restart?
It's a good question. I don't know why it didn't restart. All of a sudden, it became folklore that it never happened. So.
Okay, and when you're saying it,
board member involvement, at least the technical.
okay,
hires.
and now we are in fact doing that again, just on my direction. So are we out of this rut? Does this, because I've directed that all those people come to us. You have the option. You don't have to interview them, but you have the option to. You have the option to look at their resume, and you have the option to give me any feedback that I'll give to the hiring manager. So are we doing what we need to do now?
I personally think it's a good Band-Aid, but I think the leadership of the staff needs to have a better comfort in predictability and discipline of the process going forward. I don't think we've done, as a board member, I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I don't know if it's the long-term solution that provides predictability in the hiring process.
Well, sometimes predictability for the long term comes out of doing things the same way for the long term. So if we just keep doing it, and which I have no intention of stopping because I actually think it's a really good idea, we just keep doing it and it starts getting baked into the cake.
So what I'm hearing you say, you're going to extend the practice that you're doing?
Well, I have no intention of stopping it.
Okay.
I believe, tell me if I'm wrong, that I have board consensus that we need to do this.
So the only thing I was pointing out in my very long-winded conversation, sorry, a lot of coffee, was that it's contradictory to what the NAPA report says. And I just want to acknowledge that because I think that we don't have a bucket for that.
Yeah, that's a good
and
point.
I think that then that's how I said I think there's some contradictions in some of this.
The only thing I'd add is I'm perfectly comfortable with the current process, but I do believe as we put together the job description for the EDO is something we ought to consider as the current process, how it fits in or not, what changes should happen. It's
Okay,
just
fair enough, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to make sure. So we talk about the staff, primarily technical. We should also consider the other areas of our staff, but the aspect here is talking about I think the 3 directors are covered by our statute. And all I was saying is that if there's any difference of opinions or any proposed changes to that, I certainly don't see or support changes to that aspect. But if any of us want to, that we do it through the legal effort to look at legislative proposals. So that would be how I move forward on that one. And the last one I have, the board chairperson must truly act as a CEO. That's for you, Bruce.
Well, read the first half of the sentence.
I will. As other board members step back from day-to-day matters, like concerns for particular personnel appraisal, the board chairperson must truly act as a CEO. In this aspect of their membership on the board members must bring their best qualities of a leader, inspiring the staff to perform their functions with excellence, enforcing a climate of professionalism and respect, and actively addressing the top issues that affect organizational performance.
Yeah, this is the muddled message, because on the one hand, we're saying that we need to be more participatory in selection of the staff, particularly key staff, but all staff. And on the other hand, the board should step back. So this is the kind of where there's some cognitive dissonance that I've been talking about.
Go ahead. Another point.
I think the difference for me is in laws and regulations and collaborative processes. So it's not to say that the chairman can't say, sub of the office directors, we're going to hire so-and-so, but it's the communication process that leads up to it. So it's not all just what I call regulatory process. That would be the difference. Does that make sense?
Well, I think this example of what we've started doing now is a good one, because your option to interview technical staff, and I would encourage you to do it, your option to provide feedback to the hiring manager, but that's collaborative. It's not regulatory. In other words, it's not a set of rules. You're not having a veto or anything like that. It's just, hey, I think you maybe ought to look twice at this person before you pull the trigger. This sort of thing. So it is a collaborative process. I don't think and that's why I don't think board members should step back from this sort of thing in this particular case.
So I'm going to go back to an old hobby horse when it comes to communications, because I think we've broken down. We talked a little bit about how that's broken down, and that's the game of telephone. When it comes to day-to-day operations, you're going to do what you're going to do, and honestly, I've been in your seat, so knock yourself out. However, I think the communications process is lacking. We have to be appraised of what's happening with staff, because they're the tools by which we do our work. I didn't mean to call the staff tools. Sorry about that, guys. You understood what I'm saying. So if there's personnel changes and we're not apprised of them in real time, or if there's a filter whereby when something happens on site or something happens with a staff member, unless it's a personnel issue, and it goes to you, and for whatever reasons you don't share that with the board, and the staff feels like before they can communicate anything they have to go to the chair and then it comes down, then that's not working for me in terms of the day-to-day operations. I think the senior staff should be trained to provide information to all board members simultaneously, and whether that means we go back to gatherings or if that means we actually use email in that way with a CC, that's fine for me. I don't have to be in the operations. I need to have visibility in them to get at if there are things that are flagged for me as regulatory issues, or simply to know that, oh, the person that I thought was the cog of Idaho is no longer the cog of Idaho. Like that's pertinent information to my day-to-day job that I should have in real time.
You have two jobs and get paid the same. You're CEO and board member, right? And that's a challenge to find out, what are matters that belong to the collective board and what are matters that, in your judgment, are under the purview of a chief executive. And I think as we continue to improve our team building, our communications among ourselves, it'll go a long way to clear some of the misexpectations, issues that we're having in this regard. because in your intention to keep the trains running, on time, I think I have felt that sometimes matters that should belong to the board were just not handled like that. So I look forward to, let's keep the communications channels open, and as you continue to execute your function, it's like if my board member hat, what does it need? And if you feel that needs to be provided, then give it to all of us. So I think it's just more communication on this one. And I'm done.
Okay, we have about for the agenda, and then we have some closing things. Ms. Roberson.
Yes, I shall be very efficient, as I hope you all will be too. Okay, recommendation 12. The major heading of the recommendation is appoint an executive director for operations. Subtext, board members should appoint an executive director for operations to lead the staff filling the position after a deliberative and open search, including consideration of outside candidates. There are actually two specific paths I propose to the board, but after not just reading this, but reading the supporting information in the report, I would say filling the position, as many of you have already touched on, will provide great opportunity for improved technical and policy support, closing obvious gaps between technical staff and the administrative support functions, and will encourage greater teaming and mutual support. It also provides for a more traditional relationship between presidentially appointed officials and professional staff, I believe. The second part of recommendation 12 makes no specific recommendation other than to let SES leaders manage, and that those SESs should live up to the highest standards of professional demeanor. As I read this in the entire report, it was unclear what was actually intended here. However, it appeared that based on some of their examples, board members were preventing SESs from managing their staffs, and in turn, SESs were publicly demonizing board members. They actually included an example. Rendering an unhealthy work environment for all, so neither party was happy. No, neither party's happy. I think there must be more to understand here, and I strongly suggest the board move to arrange a team building session with the agency's career management team or a series of such. And so I'll just stop there. I have two specific suggestions, but I'll leave it open for comment if anybody wants to comment. Two specific suggestions in response to recommendation 12. You want me to just go ahead and put them? Okay. So one is to actually, not necessarily today, but in the next few days, actually set a time and place for a communications or team building session with our SES core. And then the second one I would say is, and I'm happy to do it, that's usually until Mr. Santos started signing work across the table. I will happily work with Human Resources to review some example candidate position descriptions for EDOs or executive directors at other boards and commissions and propose a job description for the full board's consideration for an EDO here. And I'm happy to work with you and legal or the rest of the board, whomever, to support pursuing congressional authorization to proceed with establishing the position. Okay.
You touch on it, reaching out to, Congress to make sure we can execute some of this. But I'm fully supportive of, and continue to be, of the idea of an ADO.
Okay, so I'm going to address all three of them.
Okay.
Time and place for SES core team building, absolutely. I think we've gone far too long without communicating directly with our senior executive staff, and I think that is that's causing some challenges. So I'm interested in finding out what the publicly demonizing thing was too, but that's a separate issue. Secondly, I would support a looking at a position description. If you work with our human resources to do that and the board can converge on a position description, I think that would be helpful in terms of timelines. I think that the sooner that we do that and we have that position description in hand to go to your third point, which is to go to Congress for Mother May I think that would be extremely helpful. But having us all on board, and I will refer back to several comments I made before. To me, this only works if we imbue that individual with the capacity to actually manage the staff and the workload with minimal interference. I don't mean that in a negative way, of board members, even though, some of us who've done the management thing before like to play in that area. We need to be able to step back. There's one other aspect that I would ask you to explore with human resources, and this is if it's supported, and I believe this can be done. I think that this position requires more than simply going out into the ether at USA Jobs. I believe that this should have an executive headhunter aspect to it, and that we get the highest caliber candidate that we can afford, which is also part of the PD, is to understand what senior exec level we can hire to, and what type of headhunting we can use.
I agree.
Hearing no other comments, Mr. Santos.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't know if it's communication. We need team building. I don't know if that's the right term to begin with, but we need to really reach out and communicate, because I just see us getting more and more, apart. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you. The only thing I was going to say is there's lots of talk regardless. So we got to get out of our bubble a little bit, because the communication's happening in spite of us.
On the EDO, and it's something that I can provide my input as we get through a unified view on the position description. Some of the challenge that I've seen is whether it's an EDO or one of the office directors, the concept of do they work for the board or do this just serve the chairman, and that dynamic is something we really have to look at and consider, especially if some of the actions kind of are on the CEO versus the board aspects of it. That has created a lot of tension and mistrust, and I see this EDO as an opportunity to address this kind of thorny issue.
This is, as I don't know if I've said it to you or to somebody else, this is not necessarily been an issue uniquely with the technical director. At one point, it was an issue with the legal counsel as to, and I think it's something we could probably spend more time on. I think there's a difference between who you work for and who you serve.
Yes.
And I think that's where we need to make the clarification. I mean, by the law, unless delegated from a performance standpoint, definitely work for the chairman.
Correct.
But I'm assuming performance expectations address serving the board.
Right.
Yeah. But I think it's a good point.
I just want to don't lose the opportunity to address something that has created division among
Right.
us. That's all.
I think we also have to be realistic, because I think that the board has put a lot of expectations on the EDO. Having the structure of an EDO in place is solving a lot of the problems, and we need to manage those expectations amongst ourselves, that we still have to put in the work, because that's not going to be the end all and be all, and we could end up in the same place if the same behaviors continue. I'd like to hear the chairman weigh in on his views of the team building and of the EDO, just because you haven't said anything.
Well, I will say the same thing Ms. Roberson said. I agree with the concepts, both of them, so I'm supportive of them.
Thank you all.
Okay, that finishes recommendation number 12. I'm going to ask Ms. Blaine to summarize the new items as best she can. Good luck with that. We'll start with 5 and go till 12. So
Okay.
go ahead.
So number 5 I have is being assigned to Mr. Hamilton for action.
Correct.
Real further discussion on that. Number 6, also assigned to Mr. Hamilton for further action.
Correct.
Number 7, also assigned to Mr. Hamilton for further action.
Correct.
Number 8, assigned to Mr. Hamilton for action. You will ensure that the DEP rep knows that this recommendation exists.
Correct.
Number 9 has been assigned to Ms. Connery for further action.
Was there more than one subset of 9?
There were
No,
4
okay.
sub-recommendations, but no specific assignments under each sub.
Well, they're all
So
part of yours.
generally, it's been assigned to Ms. Connery.
Okay.
So number 10 and number 11, I think, is where things got a little bit messy. So number 10 was broken down into 4 sub-recommendations. So the first sub, decide what significance to give the staff conducted review findings and determine the appropriate course of action. No board member assignments here, and Mr. Santos said there was no further action. The only aspect remaining is strategic safety issues and enhancing communication and ensuring that we tie this to the relationship between policies and staff procedures. So I consider this to be in progress.
It's your action. You happy with that? Okay.
Progress. Okay, sub-recommendation number 2, work from a unified agenda and work plan that implements the priorities on which board members choose to focus. Again, no specific board member assignments. There was just general agreement that you should create a unified agenda and that it would flow from the strategic plan. So in progress. Okay, sub-recommendation number 3, limit the use of additional RFBA taskings to address emergent situations and emergencies. Once again, no specific board member assignments. Everybody agreed that, the staff needs to be empowered to be responsive to emergent issues instead of relying on the board to submit an RFBA. But again, this will all flow from enhanced team building and building trust with one another, as well as better communications. So it will flow down from recommendations 2 and 4. In progress. There was a sub-recommendation number 4, but no real discussion on the matter about reconsidering the withdrawal of the never implemented process improvement that would give board members and staff an opportunity to discuss and provide input on potential RFBAs. Nothing really happened here, so I would consider this closed unless there's board member objection.
Okay. He says, this is 11, which one? 11?
This would be
or 10?
sub-recommendation number 4 under 10.
Okay, you consider that closed?
Closed.
All right.
I want to hear if anybody has to say anything.
I tried it twice, I'm done.
Okay.
There was a collateral tasking that came out of this recommendation to Mr. Hamilton.
I have a comment.
Okay.
I think the one thing, at least I suggested, I don't know if the other board members agree, that I would hold that and consider it when we get to the recommendation on our procedures.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like I said, the whole RFBA notation, we're looking at many options, so.
So I'll change that to tabled then, or in progress, excuse me.
You could tie it to Ms. Roberson's,
Yeah, if you table it now, we'll come back to it.
Okay.
That's what I would do.
Tabled. And like I said, the collateral tasking to Mr. Hamilton arising from this recommendation to develop an analysis of failed communications in order to determine why they failed and how to redress the failure.
Okay, that's not going to be part of this, so you can take that out. That's
Take it out?
something I'm doing, but that's not going to be tracked on this.
Okay.
I have a comment, and that's a good point that you bring up. We have the NAPA report, we have the IG report. We're going through this in a very methodological way, and for that we're tracking. But as we're going through this, we're all learning. We're going to get more inputs from the staff and others, and there might be areas that we want to do that were not covered by any of the recommendations. And we have to find a way also to keep tabs on that and integrate it. So I'm okay if we don't track it as part of this one because this is specific to the NAPA, but I don't want to lose sight that there's other actions that we are going to be taking to address all the issues that we're learning and tackling. So, any comments on reactions on that? So, I would just not want to lose it. I'm okay not tracking as part of the NAPA recommendation, but I just don't want to lose tracking of that.
Okay. Okay, moving on to recommendation number 11. This was divided into 3 sub-recommendations. The first, divide activities to align with roles, holding more strategic and policy matters. Again, this was tied to enhanced improvements in communications between board members and staff, as well as a recommendation 12 regarding the hiring of the EDO.
I agree.
So I consider this in progress. Sub-recommendation number 2 was to pursue legislative changes to strengthen the chairperson's role as the agency's CEO. There was a general assignment to all board members that if anybody is interested in doing this, that we would put it in the general bin of legislative changes being pursued. Otherwise, Mr. Hamilton has the assignment to keep the practice of including board members in technical staff hiring.
Yeah, and I don't think that was actually part of the recommendation, was it? It was just the opposite.
It was the opposite.
So that one is really not something we're tracking as part of this.
Okay.
I am going to continue that practice for the record, but it's not a tracking item. It's non-tracking.
Sure. All right, the final sub-recommendation, the chairperson must truly act as CEO and bring best qualities of a leader to the position. Once again, this was tied back to enhanced communications between board members as well as more team-building exercises. So I consider this in progress. No objection. Moving on to recommendation number 12. There were 3 action items assigned to Ms. Roberson as a result of this recommendation. The first is that she is going to set a time for a team-building activity with the SES Corps. Number 2, she's going to work with HR to review candidate position descriptions for EDOs at other boards and commissions and propose a full description for the board's EDO. In doing so, she's going to ensure that the PD clarifies who the EDO would serve. She will also explore with HR the possibility of using an executive headhunter to ensure we get the highest caliber candidate. Finally, Ms. Roberson will work with ODC to proceed with pursuing a legislative change to establish this position.
Good?
Excellent.
That's it.
All right. Next item of business is that I would like to offer a proposal in the form of a vote to have the next meeting after. We're having a meeting on Valentine's Day, which is the 3rd in the series of meetings that we approved. I would like to offer a next meeting in the month of March, specific date to be determined. So I'd like to make a motion that we hold a, well, I guess it would be a 4th meeting on this topic. Whatever the language of the first one was, I don't remember.
No.
What's your question?
I second.
Ms. Connery seconds the motion, but can you read what?
I'm just going to use the language from the last
That'd be
vote,
fine.
if that works. Okay.
That'd be fine.
Vote for the board to approve to conduct a 4th board member public business meeting in March of 2019 to discuss the implicit and explicit recommendations captured in the National Academy of Public Administration's Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board organizational assessment and recent Inspector General recommendations concerning the effectiveness of the DNFSB.
So moved. Ms. Connery.
Second.
Discussion.
I'm supportive of having a 4th meeting or maybe a 5th or whatever we need. But I want to consider the following. I see value of the team building exercises that are bringing us together and work better as a unit. I think we need more of them. And yes, we have one more planned. The date was the 11th. I do feel that we need more team building exercises prior to our 3rd meeting. So what I would like for us to consider is potentially having the 3rd meeting move from Valentine's Day to March to allow some of the sessions and then figure out the fourth one, whether it's probably May. Just give us a little bit more time for additional, not only team building, but preparation and making some progress on some of the actions that we're tracking. Because it's getting to the point that we got to get started to execute some of the things we're doing. And I think some of these meetings are getting a little bit too close together. That's just my view on that. So before we move on yours, I want to see any reactions to what I just talked about.
More team building, I agree. I mean, the more we work on it, the more efficient these kinds of exchanges become too. I think this week, because of the weather and other reasons, I don't feel we were as effective and efficient as we could be. But I do think the sessions that we're having, the team building sessions, are critical, and they really are the sustainment of anything we decide to do in here. So I'm supportive. Now, as far as delaying, I'm okay having it, but I think we could have another team building session before then too. That's
Let me
me.
make sure I understand what you just said. You're talking about another team building session before meeting 4. Okay, he's talking about delaying meeting 3.
Right. So put us together.
You mean before 3? You want another one before 14th?
Oh yeah.
We have one scheduled for the 11th.
I'm saying I think there's too much time to make progress in between, and I think we do need to pick up the pace personally.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is you are not inclined to delay meeting 3.
No, that's not what I intend to say. What I intend to say. I'm sorry. What I intend to say is more team building, and if we can't do more team building before session 3, then I may be okay delaying it until we can.
Well,
Does that make sense?
currently we have a team building session on the 11th, which is 3 days before the meeting number 3. Mm-hmm. If that happens and we don't have another snow day, would that be adequate?
I think more team building. And frankly, I would like to have a session with our SES Corps before session 3, but I don't know. I haven't looked at the calendar to see.
So the motion on the table is to have a 4th meeting in March. Now, if we want to readjust what we're doing in February, I'm willing to table the motion. Is that the right term? And we can make a decision on March, and then I may reintroduce the motion.
Can I speak to this
Yes,
motion
ma'am.
first? So I think it's the wrong move to delay the public meeting on the 4th because the 14th, because I believe we need to continue momentum, and a lot of these issues are cross-pollinated. So if we try to make progress on any of the other ones without looking forward and understanding where the other board members are, we're gonna get stymied. That being said, I think that there's room to say we'll have the 4th meeting in March, we'll keep the 3rd meeting in February 14th, we'll meet on February 11th, and then between now and February 11th, we ought to be able to find a date that works either for all of us to meet or all of us to meet with the senior executives, which I think would be the better idea if we can come up with a date to do that. And then we would have had 2 team buildings prior to the 14th, and we can proceed as.
Okay. I want to share I share your sentiment that we should not lose momentum, and that better is the enemy of good enough. If we try to make these meetings perfect, we're never going to have them. So my sentiment is that we should proceed with what we've got scheduled. If we can add another team building or the SES level team building, that's great. But I don't think we should delay the meeting on the 14th. And I think we should, proceed with the vote that we have on the table. Ms. Santos?
To I'm okay. I guess I'm similar to Ms. Robertson, and I just want more team buildings. But I consider our team buildings at this point, separate from the one that we're gonna do with the SESs. So I'm saying yes. We have the 11th. Let's have another team building for the 4 of us, if we can, before the 14th, and if we can also do the SES as a separate one, and if we can't do the SES one before the 14th, we'll do it before the 4th meeting. So what I'm saying is, okay, let's keep the meetings 3 and 4. We'll go through the motion, but let's add more team buildings for all us also between meetings.
This is a procedural question. We don't actually have to vote on the team meeting stuff, right? We can just agree to it? Okay.
That's correct. We can just agree to it offline. Okay. Any more discussion on the question on the table of the 4th meeting?
No, I'm good with that path, the path Mr. Santos laid out.
All right. General Counsel, call the question.
Ms. Roberson?
Yes.
Ms. Connery? Yes. Mr. Santos?
Yes.
Mr. Hamilton?
Aye. Okay. I think that's all the things we had on the agenda, plus one.
Sorry.
I'm going to open up for closing comments. Was there something else on the
Yes.
agenda?
Do we want to close the record or keep the record open for comments on the vote?
Oh, on the vote. Thank you. Does anybody want to make comments on the vote sheet? Okay, then we don't need to hold it open. Okay, thank you for bringing that up. Closing comments, Ms. Roberson.
No closing comments.
Thank you, Ms. Roberson. Mr. Santos.
This is a good start. We have NAPA, we have IG, but like I said, there's going to be other areas that we're going to be learning and that we need to integrate to all of these recommendations. I also feel that we're getting to a point that we need to start engaging not only the senior members of the staff, but our staff as part of this whole process. But I do believe we still have some work for the 4 of us to do. So I hope there's some patience to let us, figure out some of the areas we want to go before we start bringing the staff. But I look forward to that part of the process too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. Ms. Connery.
Thank you. I've said enough.
We are adjourned.